Wonderful. Stunning. This is my second to the last sermon before I go on sabbatical for 5 months. This week's sermon is going to talk a little bit about what I plan to be doing while on sabbatical. So it'll be the easier of the 2 sermons to hear, because next week's sermon, tell your friends to come, I'll be talking about what you're supposed to be doing on my sabbatical. Well, as I've talked, I'm going to be writing a book on UU Proverbs. And I first got this idea when I was reading a book called World Scripture, which I first found online. And it's a book was compiled by the Unification Church. And it arranges Scripture from many traditions by such categories of creation, the golden rule, and life after death. Within each category were quotes from the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, the Rig Veda, Buddhist scriptures, the Tao Te Ching, and quotes by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Now, I had a couple of reactions. First, I thought this book should have been written by the Unitarian Universalist Association. It's a scholarly book. It has people from all over the world bringing their expertise on their own particular religion. But we didn't do it first. We didn't think of it first. And then I noticed there were no passages from Unitarian Universalists in this book. And then I thought, well, if one was going to take a scripture of UU's, there would be no real book to draw from. We have some great histories of our tradition. We have some scholarly work, collections of sermons, and we have one great collection of essays on sale in the lobby. Part of your duty for the summer. See Greg and all that. But that's more next week's sermon than this week's sermon. But we have no book that we hand to family members, that we give out at graduations, that we read for ourselves in those quiet moments. They have sayings, aspects of our tradition. I thought, what would a UU scripture look like? Well, first I balked at the word scripture, because scripture applies absolute authority, something that Unitarian Universalists wouldn't submit to. It runs counter to our history of religious freedom. I cannot imagine a UU saying, my scripture says it, I believe it, that settles it. We have a tradition of looking for new ideas. A tradition that may have started with Emerson, who said, I hate quotations. Tell me what you know. But Emerson also said, next to the originator of a good sentence is the first quoter of it. The inherent contradictions of our tradition. And of course, Emerson had something to say about that, too. That a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. It would be foolish to try to write UU scripture. It would be so contradictory. It would have to contain both Christianity and atheism and a lot of other contradictory ideas. But then again, that is the beauty of our tradition. It enjoys the question. Scripture suggests an absolute truth, a notion that is somewhat foreign to our faith. So instead of Scripture, I suggest the term proverb. A proverb is one of those pithy sayings that are very easy to remember. Our choir sang one this morning, two roads diverged into wood, and I took the one less traveled by. These type of sayings, they demand a reaction, a sense of, wow, I get that idea, that's just like me, or gee, that idea doesn't seem to fit me. But you agree or you disagree. The truth is kind of encapsulated in such a form that it elicits that reaction, that moment of thought. We are a tradition of contradictions and comfortable with that. So to have proverbs that contradict each other kind of reflects who we are. We believe that there are many ways to find meaning in life. But this same comfort with contradictions makes us hard to grasp for people outside of our tradition. Perhaps there is someone in our history that has captured the essence of Unitarian and Universalist for us. Maybe it would be helpful to have a source of wise words to help explain ourselves. In this era of sound bites, people are unlikely to read a book of essays that you hand to them. It'd be helpful to have some words at the back of our minds that could spring to the tip of our tongue. And also, I think a book of UU Proverbs is helpful for other reasons. It displays our credibility. I mean, that's what the Unification Church was doing when they were making this giant tome, of which my book will not be nearly this size. But they were doing something that moved them out of the state of cult in our general society. They've kind of become a established religion in most recent years. But it's part of that thing of putting themselves in context. We need to do some of that too. We're called Unitarian and Universalists, and some people say, oh, is that the Unification Church? And I say, no. We actually were invented before them. And people think we're some kind of brand new crazy religion. A book of Proverbs would list a variety of people throughout American history that were part of our movement. Ben Franklin, Emerson, Susan B. Anthony, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Robert Frost. Unitarian and Universalists were present at the founding of such institutions as our nation, public education, mental hospitals, the Red Cross, the American Civil Liberties Union, Planned Parenthood, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We have been active in the causes of abolition, environmentalism, women's rights, and gay rights. American history is intertwined with the history of Unitarians and Universalists. We have been part of the expansion of liberty in the United States. Many church websites in this country contain a feature called Famous UUs. This is usually a list of politicians, writers, and social reformers that have sprung from our tradition. This is an interesting thing. I've never seen a list of famous Jews or famous Catholics. I mean, these are established traditions. They may feel less of a need to prove themselves of walking with the giants. But also UUs have been historically the type not to proselytize or display the outward trappings of their faith. Susan B. Anthony would say, well, I'm a Quaker. Although she held a membership in a Unitarian church for 50 years. She was raised Quaker, but she joined a Unitarian church. But we don't have a faith that kind of says, hey, I'm a Unitarian, and because I'm a Unitarian Universalist, I do things this way. We don't talk that way. And so many of our giants are hidden to history. And so we like to remind people that we've been here for a while. However, many of these lists overreach when claiming a person was a Unitarian Universalist. For instance, I've seen Mark Twain on some of these lists, and boy, when you're writing a quote book, you like to know that you can quote Mark Twain. He was a religious rebel, and many of his statements were congruent with Unitarian Universalism. This statement hints at universalism. Jesus died to save men, a small thing for an immortal to do, and he didn't save many anyway. But if he had been damned for the race, it would have been an act of a size proper to a god if he would have saved the whole race. Despite of the existence of Unitarian Universalist churches, Twain belonged to the Presbyterian Church in Hartford and the Congregational Church in Elmira, mostly at the bidding of his wife. So, regrettably, I'm unable to include him in my collection, and boy, this is painful, because he is so quotable. But it's part of a judgment call, because in contrast, I've included Jane Addams, the mother of social work, who was baptized Presbyterian when she was 20, and by the time she was 21, never darkened the door of a Presbyterian church again, and worked with Jenkin Lloyd Jones and his Unitarian church in Chicago, which helped support some of her ventures such as Hull House. Unitarians are harder to pin down about membership in the church. The Universalists organized in 1790, and so it's easier to determine someone either joined or didn't join. But Unitarians didn't organize as a named body until 1825, and that was only an association of ministers. And the National Conference of Congregations, where everybody who belonged to a church that had a Unitarian minister could say that they belonged to the Unitarian denomination, didn't form until 1865. So prior to these periods, it's easier to take liberty to include some people who may not have belonged to a Unitarian church, but had ideas in harmony with Unitarian Universalism. This is particularly true during the period of the American Revolution. There was a unique constellation of these revolutionaries. Ben Franklin and Joseph Priestley were both members of a Unitarian church in England, and Ben Franklin financed Priestley's Unitarian church in Philadelphia. And they, being scientists, were in conversation with Thomas Jefferson, who was officially Anglican, but professed in his writings that he was a Unitarian. Their friend Benjamin Rush was a doctor and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, wrote the founding charter of Universalism, and he also joined with Franklin in 1776 to form the first anti-slavery society. Meanwhile, back in England, Mary Wollstonecraft, a Unitarian, was writing The Vindication of the Rights of Man, which influenced Thomas Paine, who wrote The Rights of Man, and other pamphlets which sparked the revolution. And Paine later wrote very scathing critiques of Christianity, as did fellow revolutionary hero Ethan Allen. John Adams in Boston was a Unitarian, a political opponent of Jefferson in their prime, but during their retirement, they wrote many letters to each other exploring the nature of religion. Abigail Adams, his wife, was a feminist and wanted women included in the American Revolution. She and Universalist Judith Sargent Murray were echoing the sentiments of Mary Wollstonecraft, who had also written Vindication of the Rights of Women. So here we have, in the formative years of our nation, you have the making of a stew that would be Unitarian Universalism. Emphasis on the humanity of Jesus and his ethic of universal love was the stock of that stew. And floating in the stew were human rights, women's rights, minority rights, and religious freedom. The devotional Christianity of Benjamin Rush is the salt that has not lost its flavor, but is peppered with the atheism of Ethan Allen. And both are critical ingredients to who we are. After the Revolutionary period came a period of religious radicalism. Early Universalists believed that there would be some punishment for sins after death before all were reconciled to God. But Jose Ballou, in his Treatise of Atonement, advocated ultra-universalism that argued that God was so loving that he would receive his children immediately after death. His cousin Aidan Ballou believed that the nonviolence of God should inspire the nonviolence among humanity. This idea, combined with Thoreau's civil disobedience, inspired Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. in the 20th century. Unitarianism, as a theological position, was a quiet movement within Congregationalist denomination. It was whispered and alluded to, but never proclaimed, until William Ellery Channing preached a sermon entitled Unitarian Christianity in Baltimore in 1819. He felt the notion of a divine Jesus was not supported by the Scriptures and interfered with the worship of one God. Jesus was the supreme human example of how to worship God and lead a godly life. That wasn't radical enough for Ralph Waldo Emerson, who thought that even this liberal Unitarians was not liberal enough. He left his job as a Unitarian minister to found a movement called Transcendentalism. He urged people not to rely on the authority, but trust their own intuition and to find the holy. His protege, Henry David Thoreau, never belonged to a church. It could be argued that a book of UU Proverbs shouldn't include someone who quit the denomination and someone who never joined a church. But their influence on the movement is too profound to be ignored. To leave them out of my book would be like leaving John the Baptist and Mother Mary out of the Christian tradition. They may not have been disciples, but the story can't be told without them. Another distinction of Unitarian Universalism is that faith is best observed by action. In the volume, I will include reformers who work to make things better here on earth. And this is the difference between worshiping Jesus and emulating Jesus. To worship Jesus as a God means asking forgiveness to secure one's own personal salvation. It's a selfish act to make sure you get your reward in heaven. To emulate Jesus is to follow his example of saving the world by feeding the poor, healing the sick, and welcoming the outcast. Unitarians did the latter. Thus, Dorothea Dix encouraged care for the mentally ill. And Universalists took a slightly different path to social action. With the assurance of salvation for all, they could not exclude people by judging them as hopeless sinners. So rather than casting them aside, they realized they needed to include them in making a better world. Thus, during the Civil War, Clara Barton, who founded the Red Cross, nursed both Confederate and Union soldiers, believing that God cared for all humanity. The veneration of science is also a major part of Unitarian Universalism. Frank Lloyd Wright and Buckminster Fuller were architects, but their buildings were infused with a holistic philosophy of life. This building resembles a Frank Lloyd Wright building in that it's situated in nature and it's in line with Pilot Mountain, reflecting that transcendentalism of Emerson. A perfect place to hold an Earth Day celebration, by the way. Luther Burbank took Darwin's theory of natural selection to improve crops by intentionally selecting for desired characteristics. And Clarence Darrow defended the right to teach evolution in the famous Scopes trial. Linus Pauling won a Nobel Prize for chemistry and then turned his attention to a nuclear test ban and won the Nobel Peace Prize, the only person to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different fields. In the 20th century, we certainly had an emphasis on the practical religion that avoided speculation and superstition. Free inquiry looked for practical solutions to improve life on earth and our earthly task of living together. And balancing this empirical strain is the UU sense of poetry. We have a few poets in our tradition. Longfellow, Emily Dickinson, Frost, Sandburg, E. Cummings, May Sarton. I could do a whole book on UU poets. They remind us of our highest aspirations. These words from Longfellow. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints in the sand of time. Transcendentalist Walt Whitman also attended the National Universalist Church in Washington, did not conceive of God as a distant superior being, but God as the stuff of every day. Why should I wish to see God better than this day? I see something of God each hour of the 24 and each moment then. In the faces of men and women I see God, and in my own face in the glass. I find letters from God dropped in the street, and everyone is signed by God's name. And I leave them where they are, for I know wheresoever I go, others will punctually come forever and ever. And Robert Frost encourages us to take risks. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Unitarian Universalism is indeed the road less traveled. It seeks to be a religion that includes rather than excludes. That means sometimes we have to live with ambiguity and contradictions. But May Sarton reminds us that seeming contradictions may just be complementary parts of the whole truth. She writes, "Help us to be always helpful gardens of the Spirit. Who knows that without darkness, nothing comes to birth, and without light, nothing flowers." Darkness and light, the contradictions that we live with and face every day. So this summer, I'm going to be immersing myself into contradictory sayings of so many Unitarians and Universalists. And I hope to whittle it down. People like Emerson, which 30 am I going to take? Quotes. But to try to whittle down all this writing into a usable form, not a comprehensive book in any means, because a comprehensive book on our faith would be a book written by everyone in this room and everyone who sat in this room before us and in all the rooms that have housed Unitarian and Universalists. But a small book, a portal to our past, something we can share with friends and families, something we can use to remind others that they too are kindred spirits on this journey. It's not a book of answers, but a catalyst for questions. A struggle with the ideas that have been struggled by great minds before that will help us move into the future. Plus, I'm going to do some travel and sit in my backyard and work on my pool. Of course, being with nature would be considered a UU spiritual practice. I'm going to miss being with you, but I am going to find myself renewed. I think when you come out of seminary, you get this idea you've been studying for 3 years and you got all this good stuff and you want to share with people, and you say, I'm going to be a minister because I think a minister reads all week and speaks for 20 minutes. And then you enter the ministry and find out that you don't get a chance to read at all and still have to speak for 20 minutes. So a chance to just immerse myself in this will be a wonderful thing. And I hope you too take chance away from me saying stuff to you, to think of what this tradition means to you and what you will say to anybody you encounter about this community and this faith and this heritage that means so much to you. May we bless and be blessed.